evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and this purring creature is Gingersnap. Welcome back to our living room for the conclusion of our increasingly erratically themed series of faith and fiction. So, funny story. This afternoon, I was doing my hair, actually, and thinking at that time that we were going to wrap up tonight, thank you, with some of the stories of the 12 disciples, because there's all sorts of interesting legends about them. There's only two of them. We know how they die in the scriptures themselves, but they've all got all these legends. So like Andrew was crucified, but he didn't want to be on like a cross-shaped cross because he wasn't good enough to be killed the way Jesus was. So Andrew is crucified on an X-shaped cross. So that's why the St. Andrew's cross on the flag of Scotland is an X. Anyway, all sorts of stories that are very interesting. But like I said, I was doing my hair at this moment in time, and I suddenly remembered, Mary Magdalene is a redhead. We need to talk about this. So obviously a woman in the Middle East at this time wouldn't actually historically have been a redhead, but in art she is. So how do we get there? The Middle Ages were weird, and also a pope. So, I forget how many months ago we were doing a series on creation stories, and so I was explaining that it's not an apple in Genesis, it's just a piece of fruit. But the reason we remember it as being an apple is because it's a pun in Latin that the word for apple and the word for evil are very close together. So in Latin, it's very clever wordplay of being tempted by evil, being tempted by knowledge, but it sounds like apple, so it's clever. I don't speak Latin, pretty sure you don't speak Latin, and yet this remains. Thanks, I forget which pope that was, but that was a pope in a sermon who was making a Latin joke. So, yet again, thanks to a pope, Gregory the Great, in a sermon that he gave in, I believe, 591, Mary Magdalene is a prostitute in this sermon, not in the Bible, with a lot of connections being... Anyways, to get to the redhead part before the prostitute part. So the way that we tell saints apart in art is they've got something that identifies them. So when I was talking about this in the Wilgefortis episode, we were saying, if you're at a birthday party, it's costumes, princesses, then a blue ball gown is probably Cinderella, someone who's carrying a stuffed fish is maybe Ariel, and so there's, colors or sidekicks or props that tell you which princess the little girls are. So in art, Mary Magdalene has red hair. So it's a bit convoluted. So first I am going to read a story from the Gospel of Luke that Mary Magdalene is not in. This should make sense. So, from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verse 36 on, hopefully without my cat biting my Bible. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And a woman in the city, who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears, and to dry them with her hair. Then she continued kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner." Jesus spoke up and said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." "Teacher," he replied, "speak." A certain creditor had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both of them. Now which of them will love him more? Simon answered, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the greater debt. And Jesus said to him, You have judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. Hence she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. Then Jesus said to her, Your sins are forgiven. But those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, Who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. This is the word of the Lord. So, as I said, this is not a story about Mary Magdalene. In fact, it is a story about a woman, and her name is not given. You might also notice that she is referred to throughout the story as a sinner and not a prostitute. I actually looked up the Greek word this afternoon. It is very straightforwardly sinner. That could really mean any of a number of things. It could also have been used in that time and context to refer to a Jew who wasn't super observant. So, I mean, I guess with some creative licensing, I mean, sex sells, so maybe it's a more fun story if she's a prostitute. It's more colorful, gets people's attention, I guess. I mean, sure, sinner could include that, but that's really conjecture. That's really bordering into fan fiction, honestly. I would straight up call that fan fiction if you're making an assumption that big about a woman who is a sinner, because spoiler alert, we are all sinners. Other than Jesus, we are all sinners. Cats obviously don't consider themselves to be sinners, but yeah, whatever. She's purring. Just sinner, not prostitute. But so she dries Jesus's feet with her hair, which is an odd thing to do. It's a detail that definitely stands out in the story. So if you're looking for this particular woman in a painting of a bunch of scenes in Jesus's life, the woman whose hair stands out, that's going to be this woman. So often martyrs especially are shown with their method of execution. So there are saints who are holding their skin because they were flayed alive, which is just charming. Or maybe a saint is holding an axe. I forget which of the apostles that one is, that sort of thing. But what stands out from her story is her hair. So to make her hair stand out, she's not wearing a headscarf, it's down and flowing, and to make it especially distinctive, it is quite often red. It would be more effective for me to be doing a big hair flip right now if I hadn't bleached and dyed my hair purple within the past year. Here we are. This part's still red. It's just, anyway. So, yes. So in a sermon that he gave in the year 591, Pope Gregory the Great named this woman as being Mary Magdalene. It's not Mary Magdalene. I mean, I guess technically it could have been, but again, that's straight up fan fiction to say that it definitively was. It just says a woman who was a sinner. Mary Magdalene shows up 12 times throughout the Gospels. That's significantly more than some of the apostles even. So the authors could have named her if that was Mary Magdalene. It would be weird if they just referred to her as a woman who was a sinner. Point being, it's not Mary Magdalene. But in a sermon that Pope Gregory the Great gave in 591, he named the woman who was a sinner as being Mary Magdalene. And he named her as being a prostitute. Because it makes kind of it does make a nice bookend thematic image of the woman who anointed Jesus' feet before his death being the same woman who goes to the tomb to anoint him after his death. So that would be a very neat kind of parallel, and it is a very dramatic and effective story to have someone whom you consider a particularly terrible kind of sinner to be redeemed from being a prostitute to being one of Jesus's most faithful followers, apostle to the apostles, if you will. And I mean, yeah, that is a good story. And you could use a story like that as a sermon illustration if you want to. It would be very effective. But it's not fair to say that that was Mary Magdalene, because it wasn't. That's not in the text. It doesn't say that the woman was a prostitute. It just says that she was a sinner. Women are capable of sins other than prostitution. I'm just saying. Thing that annoys me. And this is all thanks to one sermon given in the year 591 by Pope Gregory the Great. I would be willing to bet that most people couldn't tell you who Pope Gregory the Great was or what century he was preaching in, but people know that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Cool. So, let's read a story that Mary Magdalene is in. And again, she shows up 12 times throughout all 4 Gospels. And in each of the Gospels, she is present at the crucifixion. Well, technically, Luke doesn't name the women at the foot of the cross, but in at least 3 of the Gospels, she is definitively named as being there, when most of the male disciples were off doing their own thing. Somewhat pedantically, disciple is student and apostle is someone who is sent out to teach. So this far removed in time, they're kind of simultaneously apostles and disciples, sort of depending on what point in the story you're referring to them as. It's kind of pedantic though, so they're sort of interchangeable. Anyway, so as you know, probably, Jesus died. I hope that is not a spoiler to you for how the story ends. He comes back though, so spoiler alert. So near the end of the Gospel of John, chapter 20, the Easter story. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman," excuse me. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. This is the word of the Lord. So in all 4 of the Gospels, the women are, and especially Mary Magdalene, are the first ones to show up and find out that Jesus has risen, because all the guys are locked up in an upper room, fairly freaked out, for good reason, that the authorities might execute them for the same crimes for which they executed Jesus, which is not paranoia. That could very well have happened, to be fair. So the fact that all of the Gospels name Mary Magdalene specifically, and a group of women more generally, as being present at the foot of the cross to witness the death of Jesus and then to witness his resurrection is historically a very interesting point, and almost certainly proves that it happened, because thanks patriarchy and sexism, women were not credible witnesses. So if Mary Magdalene had been in a court of law and she had said, "Jesus isn't dead anymore, he is arisen," wow, no one it wouldn't have counted. Her testimony wouldn't have counted because she wasn't a dude. sexism. So the fact that the gospel writers recorded this, when it's not a compelling aspect of their argument, it kind of does tell us that they happened, because it would be a really weird thing for them to make up, because the word of women wasn't good enough. But women are the first people to preach the resurrection and to share the good news that Jesus is not dead, he is risen. And yet there are churches who wouldn't ordain me, even though women literally were the first preachers of the gospel. Like, literally. That's another issue for another time. Anyway, so Mary Magdalene does kind of have a complex history, thanks Gregory the Great, but she is still depicted as having unique hair. And even more fun, kind of tying back to Wilgefortis even more. So because Mary is a very common name, even today, but it was the most common name for women in the century. There's a bunch of other Marys running around. But obviously there's also Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so the reason we refer to her as Mary Magdalene, Mary from the city of Magdala, is to differentiate her. So it's kind of easy, especially before there's a very organized library or whatever, to confuse this Saint Mary with other Saint Marys, because there have been a bunch. So there was another Saint Mary, I want to say Saint Mary of Egypt. I'm not Catholic. I only had 3 years of Catholic school. What do I know? And she was a hermit. So she went off into the desert to live by herself, to dedicate her life to God. And because she was in the desert, which is kind of a rough climate, which wouldn't have been very easy on her clothing. So anyway, she's out in the desert long enough that all of her clothing wears away, so she's out there naked. But to protect her decency, God really helps out her hair growth, so that, and depending on who you ask, this is either the hair on her head or body hair, but she has so much hair that her modesty is protected. This is not as common in art as the beautiful redheaded woman, often with excess skin showing, because that's fun to do in art, to objectify women. So sometimes if there's a particularly hairy woman and it's not Wilgefortis, then it somehow is Mary Magdalene or Mary of the Egypt or whatever, the hermit, because those stories get confused. Which I love the Middle Ages. And speaking of the Middle Ages, so last week I was gushing about how Joseph of Arimathea, also tying into the resurrection story. So Joseph of Arimathea was the one who took Jesus' body and laid it in his own grave. And then, according to legend, he went to England and became a bishop there to spread the gospel in England, because sure, why not? Similarly, there is a story that Mary Magdalene and a handful of other of her contemporaries, other women, etc., were put in a boat that didn't have a rudder or sails, and the idea was this was a sentence of death, basically. But Mary Magdalene and the other sailors on this boat landed in France. And so Mary Magdalene lived out the rest of her years in France and died there, depending on who you ask. Her body was found and is in, I forget which church. So Mary Magdalene was spreading the gospel in France, which almost certainly didn't happen, especially because the story was written down quite a few centuries later, but it's a really great story. So Mary Magdalene is the subject of probably the most fan fiction of New Testament characters, although, oh boys, there are literally a lot of Jesus fan fiction. I wrote a whole paper on this in college, which I'm not getting into. Was Mary Magdalene married to Jesus? In short, no. I could get into that more, but in conclusion, no. Just because she's the woman who shows up the most is the only reason why she is chosen to be considered his... It didn't happen. Which, again, is entirely its own thing, but it didn't happen in conclusion. Although, with more language pun things of Latin. So Holy Grail, San Graal, Holy, San, Graal, Grail. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but we literally don't know how anything was pronounced in Latin, which is another story. I'm really all over the place tonight, my apologies. So someone decided that it would be cool if you kind of like put those words together and then like rearranged them. So then it was Sang, Raal, royal blood, instead of Holy Grail, which is not how etymology works, but someone decided it would be cool. Anyway, that is literally, that bit of wordplay is why someone decided that Jesus has great whatever grandchildren running around, which that's really not how history is done. Really not how history is done. If something is not written down for like 600 years after the person dies, it's pretty unlikely that it's a good source. So I'm just saying. And I mean, given that Mary Magdalene, again, she shows up 12 times in all 4 Gospels, and in all 4 Gospels, she is a fairly significant follower of Jesus. Don't really understand why we need to make up stuff about her, because she's already significant. Anyway, so in conclusion, Mary Magdalene is a redhead, so, and again, I'm not currently as much of a redhead as I was before, but anyway. There's so few things that I have had control over throughout the pandemic that I dyed my hair purple. So, fun ramblings about Mary Magdalene that tie into all sorts of other things, and apparently confused my cat enough that she's run off to have seconds of her food. So anyway, good night, pupils. I hope to see some of you tomorrow night for our Wednesday evening prayer. On Sunday morning, I do want to mention again that instead of meeting at the church, we are having our church service in Wilson Park at 10 a.m. So I invite you to bring a chair if you can and join us there. We will be having our service with Marble United Methodist and Pilgrim's Rest Church. So it should be a fun time. I was just meeting with Pastor Matt this morning to work out some more of the details. So I hope to see some of you there. In the meanwhile, good night from me and not my cat. I can't make her wave because she's run off. But I hope you were all well and inspired by the fun stories of Mary Magdalene.